Hello, innovators. I'm Dustin Miller, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Niki Torres, the founder, producer, and host of the Tshaped Friends podcast, community builder, former director of growth, communications expert, and Tshaped growth marketer. I had to look over to my notes real quick because that was a long list, and I love doing those long lists. It always makes me so excited. So thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Cool. Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah. So please say hello to the innovators in the audience.
Hi, innovators. I'm Niki. Like Dustin said, I'm the host and producer of Tshaped Friends. I'm really excited to be on this show and kind of like be on the other side of this interview because normally I'm the one interviewing people. So
yeah, it's a lot of fun. I realized that when I went on other people's shows, you can make it easier for the host just by being a host by naturally, but it's also more fun because then you don't have to do all the work.
Yeah, that's true.
And so one way I like to start the show is to ask you to share something about yourself that no one knows about you.
Oh, wow. I have a lot of them.
Perfect.
Okay. Not that no one knows it, but not a lot of people know it. So I grew up here in Asia where we don't have 4 seasons. There's no such thing as winter where I grew up in, but I am actually a figure skater when I was young.
That's cool.
So I could dance and jump and twirl on ice.
So there's no ice around you now.
Yeah. That's not something that everyone knows, especially here. It's like not a sport that a lot of people do.
Mm-hmm. Is there no like ice rink in Singapore?
There is, but obviously it needs to be a rink, right? Like not unlike if you're in a country like the US where you have winter, more people, I guess, know how to do it versus somebody like me who not only knows it, but knows all of the tricks.
Yeah. Have people of your own like skill level, so to speak. So you got your podcast and blogging and community building going on, but what got you started before all of that? What was your mindset?
Before everything or like before my whole career?
I guess either one, but I guess before the content creation first.
Yeah, so I think it really started quite early when I was in high school, before this whole social media thing and before blogging became like a business. Back then, it was really just me penning my thoughts online. And then obviously, as the world kind of progressed into social media and all of those things, I've kind of built my career in terms of all of those changes. But it wasn't until in late 2018 where I had an idea for a podcast, and I was so excited because I think I really wanted to start a podcast back in 2012. I even had a mic that I had to sell because I was like, I don't have an idea. I'm not going to be able to create this right now. So I let that go. And then in 2018, I read a book. I got really inspired. And then I had so many ideas, like 3 ideas. And out of those 3, I was able to kind of like land on Tshaped Friends. And then it was more of like running after that. It almost felt like I had no control of this inspiration or idea. It feels like I was called to do it and I just had to get it out there in the world, like.
Yeah, no, exactly. It sounds like synchronicity to me where things just kind of line up and you have to just go do it.
Exactly. Yeah.
What was that book you mentioned?
It was a book called Playing Big by Tara Moore. But before that, I was also reading another book called Drop the Ball by Tiffany Dufu. So these were all books written by women. And it kind of like helped me really understand our experiences and how, different our experiences are and how maybe because of those cultural, social biases, we are playing small, basically. So after reading that, I realized like, oh, actually, I don't need to be an expert in order to go out there and share my experiences. One of the lines that I really, really love from that book was, we have to teach what we have to learn. And I love that because it doesn't put stress on me having to be an expert at something before I could share it. So I kind of like that gave me permission to just approach everything with curiosity, and it doesn't matter if I'm a beginner and I could share that experience anyway. Yeah.
Well, and what I get from that too, Niki, is that when you take something, when you get that input, you end up putting it into an output of some sorts. And people who don't, especially as content creators, we have that as an output. And so we don't have all these ideas just bubbling up from the input. We now have a release that we can control. And if we have a brilliant idea, even if it's only marginal improvement than what most people know, we can give it life, give it out there.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like we're meant to be in this world to create and share it. It doesn't matter if we get like a million people
Yeah.
consuming it. Even just sharing it with one person kind of like helps with the anxiety of like, I have something to say, please somebody listen to
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know what this movie was. Maybe it was like Good Will Hunting or something like that. But this guy was able to work any job essentially just by knowing enough to do it. And at one point,
Mm.
he was a professor for like 6 months or something like that. And the only way he was able to do it is because he kept reading a chapter ahead of all the students he was teaching. So he would just teach
Oh,
that chapter the next day. And it's
right.
brilliant because that's all you have to do to really know what it is.
You just need
So,
to know a little bit more than the people who you're teaching, right?
exactly. So diving into some of the questions here, when I felt that when I first reached out to you that you're kind of in the middle ground of the specialist and generalist. So, and that's a good thing. This whole T-shaped idea. What are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on the T-shaped stuff?
I think like in terms of T-shaped, so I guess for a lot of your viewers or listeners, T-shaped is basically having a broad set of knowledge, but having at least one expertise. So that's where the T comes from. So broadness and then depth. I really love this because it kind of, for the longest time, I felt like I was all over the place. I liked so many things. But in the end, I realized that there was this thing called growth marketing where I could actually put together all of the things that I know
Mm-hmm.
and be known for something and kind of like go and do that. So I like what you said that it's kind of like in between because I feel like sometimes people are so stressed about becoming experts in everything that they're interested in. And then there are people who are just interested in so many things and then they jump, which is not bad, to be honest. But
Mm-hmm.
then there are people like me who kind of like, I want to know a lot of things because I'm curious about it, but I also want to be known for something. And when we think about what is marketing today, it's really, when you tell people they have to niche down, they
Mm-hmm.
get scared because they're like, but I love so many things. I can't just focus on one thing.
Yeah.
But that's not what we're trying to say, right? We're just trying to say that you need to market with one thing, like your expertise. It doesn't mean that you have to stop doing everything else. So it's kind of like a great way to stand out in a
Yeah.
way.
Well, and one thing I've been trying to push too is this idea of planning ahead, phases in a way. So
Mm,
PolyInnovator has phases. Right now, the first one's around education. The next one, my background's in exercise and physiology. So I want to be able to teach people the stuff I know when it comes to exercise and improvement. And I think that if you have a T shape, who knows, maybe it can be a double T at one point, and then you have another T down the line, another specialty. And whether that takes a year or a decade, it doesn't really matter, but just setting yourself
exactly.
up with the expectation, okay, I niche down right now, but then change it down the
Mm.
line.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are scared of becoming boxed in, and I totally understand that feeling. And that's what's scary about kind of like niching down, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I guess for a lot of people, even a lot of the big companies that we know and admire today, the people that we admire and who have really amazing brands today, they started with something completely different. I
Mm-hmm.
think we always think that we have to do something and then stick with it forever. So I love this thing where I read something that there is this 7-year cycle.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're meant to do something for 7 years and then we move on to the next thing. And I kind of
Mm-hmm.
like feel that way, to be honest. Like I could be obsessed. To be honest, I mentioned earlier my ice skating, right? I was obsessed with that for 7 years, and then I moved on
Mm-hmm.
to another thing. But I learned enough in those 7 years to be able to be kind of like an expert about it, right? And
Yeah.
then move on to something that I was interested in. So I feel like there's a lot of anxiety about having to just choose and then choose that forever. But I think for a lot of people, you have to understand that you're allowed to change your mind.
Yeah. Well, and I was going off of that too, the whole 7 years thing, that also goes for friendships as well. There's another psychology like paper that goes around that idea of most friendships last for 7 years. And if it lasts longer than
Mm,
that, then you know it's probably going to last a lifetime. And
right.
what's interesting too about careers is that we always think that, considering our history, we're working at one job for 40 years. Now, that may be true. You might be working for that one company for 40 years, 50, 60 years, but your job in that company is going to change. You're going to go entry level, middle level, upper level if you get lucky enough, or maybe pivot in some way. No matter what, you're changing your career. And they say that even if you're changing companies too, your career changes every 6 to 9 years, essentially. And so you have
Mm.
almost 12 by the end of your life, anyways.
Yeah, I think that's really true. So I've been working for more than a little over 12 years now. And if you look at, I've had one 7-year cycle within that experience. And I kind of felt that way because I started doing communications, and then I've kind of transitioned into doing growth now.
Mm.
So yeah. Now that you mention it, I'm like, yeah, I think so. That's quite true.
Well, and what's interesting too is just not talk too much about myself, but I taught swim lessons for 7 years now, basically at this point. And now I'm starting to feel like I need to transition out and do something else. And so it's just interesting how 7 years is such a weird number, but once that hits, you don't even realize it until afterwards too. So what is a T-shaped growth marketer in your words then?
So for me, I guess if you think about it, marketing is such a broad subject, right? You could have different marketers focusing on different things. You have paid marketing, SEO, content, PR and media, and all of those things. For me, a T-shaped marketer is basically an expert in one of those things, but looks at the full cycle of marketing. Because I think one of the great things about business is that it doesn't really work in a vacuum. You can't just be looking at paid media and not understand how that affects all of the other things. So for me, a growth marketer is a more holistic marketer in a sense, because you know that whatever it is you're doing affects other parts of the business, and you need to know how that kind of connects, and then how can you do your job better. So I think that's what T-shaped marketers are for me.
That's interesting. And it seems like we're going on the way of omnichannel. In order to really be successful nowadays, you have to be everywhere in some shape or form. And I know that not everyone can do that. Not everyone really should do that on their own. If you have a team to help you, that's great. But I do think that it's possible for like you and I to know all those things, but it just takes time to do so. And for example, I do too much inbound marketing, but not enough paid. Some people do way too much paid. I know a guy who only did paid and never touched social media content ever. It's like, why? Why won't you do both? And just one of those things where, yeah, kind of dipping out of your comfort zone in a way.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's great. To be honest, I feel like omnichannel came out of the corporate world because they have all of the resources to be able to do omnichannel. But if you're like a one-person team, it's really, really hard to do omnichannel and do it great.
Mm-hmm.
So I do mentorship for a lot of early stage startups and podcasters. And I always tell them, you kind of like have to pick one or two at the beginning and really just go after, because for what I do, right, growth, I basically have to choose which channels would give us the best return on investment. So even if, let's say, I have $100 a day, I'm not going to spend $1 for every channel. I'm going to take $50 and put it in one channel and make sure that I put it in the right one, the one where I have the most potential to grow. So for example, like you said, you're doing inbound, and I think that works for you. For other people, if they do inbound, it will take years or months before they could even see any movement in that. So they've had to really go after paid in order to see that initial growth. And I think it really depends on kind of like the industry you're in, the topics that you're in. Some industries, maybe nobody's really searching for it, so doing kind of like inbound might be hard. But maybe a lot of folks are attending events. So that's where you see people kind of like focus on events, even though they don't have any SEO stuff behind them or they're not on social. So it's really just being able to understand where does your audience live, and you want to be in front of them. And even if they're in like 20 different places, if you have limited resources and budget, you can't be in 20 places all at the same time. So you kind of like have to focus. So I guess the thing that we're kind of like seeing, the pattern that I'm seeing, is this whole niching thing, like really having to focus some of those energies, even though when you take a step back, there's so many kind of like roads we could take. But at the beginning, we kind of like have to make that hard decision of going like, hey, I want to go this way. So we actually go somewhere rather than trying to run in so many different directions.
Yeah, well, it takes balance. I think that's what kind of key point we're both making here. Is it takes balance. Whether you're a specialist or a polymathic person, you need to find you need to focus on one thing. You also need to focus on many things. And whatever you start at, if you're more someone who's like broad ranging, you need to find some platform, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever one you're picking, or some kind of media like email, something like that. Focus on it, like you're saying. Spend 50%, 60, 70, 80% of it, if you like to say Pareto's principle, and spend the rest of 20% on the other ones. So you have that wide ranging, but not as much time focused on that.
Correct. I feel like with the internet right now, there's so much information, and there's, this whole FOMO thing is super real, right? And I feel like that's why a lot of people think that, no, I have to be in every place all at once. And trying to kind of just focus on some of those things is tough.
Mm-hmm.
Like I feel that anxiety as well sometimes.
Yeah, and it's interesting too. I think we'll go into a little bit more on that a little bit later on, because it's just one of those things where being everyone at once, I think, is possible nowadays. But even as a solopreneur, but it takes so much effort. And do you really want to be that way when one channel might work as much? So that's the debate we might have later. But what do you think? What do you think it takes then to be T-shaped in any field?
Oh wow, definitely curiosity, obviously, and you need to be self-directed. Definitely, that's one of those things. You can't learn if you don't want to. I mean, you can't learn enough if you're not self-directed. And I guess at the end of the day, it is being okay to be a beginner. I think that's where a lot of the ego comes, right? A lot of people don't want to switch or change because they feel like sunk cost fallacy.
Oh, sunk cost. Okay.
Yeah. So I feel like for a lot of people, if they feel like, oh, I've been doing this thing for 4 years, I don't want to change because I don't want to start from the bottom. Right. And you have to be able, I guess, in order for you to be a T-shaped marketer, you have to be okay in being a beginner, but it doesn't mean that you're starting from square one. Because I think a lot of people, when they learn something new, you bring a lot of your past experiences into it, and that experience becomes, when you're learning something new, that experience becomes richer versus somebody who knows zero things and then learns that thing. So like even now, for example, my boyfriend's learning coding, and all of them are coming from different backgrounds. And the fact that they all come from different backgrounds, they are learning how to program software in a totally different way because of what they know previously. And they bring that all into the industry and what they're learning. And I think that's a beautiful thing. So I think in order for somebody to be a really good T-shaped person is to be okay with that. We have to kind of like let go of a lot of the ego that we have.
Yeah. Well, in yoga, there's a thing called the beginner's mind, where when you first start out, you have that curiosity to do things. But then as you get more complacent, even yoga instructors experience this. They realize, oh, I'm no longer curious or excited about it. And there's also a thing called flow, where if you don't have enough tension of uncomfortableness, and if you're too complacent, you're already too used to it, you won't get into flow. But if you have the balance of it's challenging enough and you're not bored enough, you'll get into flow and get into that focus state.
Right. Yeah. Actually, now that you mentioned, so having this conversation with you, I'm having a lot of realization. So we mentioned that 7-year thing, and then you mentioned yoga, and I'm kind of like in this part of my yoga practice. I've been practicing for 8 years, but I started this year just focusing on Ashtanga yoga because I felt like I really had to go back to the basics and kind of like really look at everything as if I'm a beginner, So it's kind of like, I'm not doing anything new. It's still yoga, but I've kind of like shift my mindset, where before I was like, oh yeah, I know yoga. I know what all the poses are called and all of those things. But for this year, it was more of like, okay, it's almost like I don't know anything and I'm coming into this practice like I'm totally new. So I am revisiting the very basic poses, sun salutations, and all of those things. And I realized because of that, I became more curious about my body, about my practice. And I realized that I've been doing a lot of things perhaps wrongly, or maybe I learned it earlier as a beginner and I've never really transitioned out of it. So I kept doing kind of like the beginner stuff and never took a leap. So now it's more of like coming back, I guess, into square one, but with a little bit more clarity and a little bit more purpose in how I'm learning things. So yeah.
Experience in a way. It makes me think, I'm a gamer. We talked about beforehand, I have 3 screens here. It's obviously nerdy, but when you're playing a game, you get so into, and then you go so far into it, and eventually you get to the point where you're just basically this person in the game who can do anything you want. Well, that's boring. You can do everything, and that's probably a good analogy for life too at some point. But so sometimes it's kind of fun where there's a particular place where they strip you of all of your items and powers, anything like that. So you have to start from scratch, and just for that little mission, essentially. And it's just interesting how that feeling of newness again makes you feel more excited about it. And sometimes people will just restart a game just for the beginning area, just to get that experience of playing it again for the first time.
Yeah, I think that's why when, a lot of people say like, oh, when I lost my job, it kind of like became a blessing in disguise, because you're kind of like, you're stripped of all of the things that maybe you were very comfortable with. And then suddenly you're like you're laid bare and you have to be resourceful again. Like if you think about it, when I was a student, I was so resourceful because I didn't have a lot of money. But obviously, as you start earning a salary, you're like, oh yeah, I can just pay somebody to do this. I don't have to do anything. Like, and then you become complacent. But now, because I'm trying to work for myself, so obviously I'm not getting paid for anything. Now I'm becoming resourceful again.
Yeah, definitely understand that. Well, and it's just interesting too. There's one of my favorite quotes is from a show called Notion.so, where when you hit your lowest point, you're most open to change. And it's just a beautiful quote because when you do hit your lowest point, whether you lost your job because of COVID or you changed jobs and you want to try something new and you're in a new city, moving across the world. I want to move to Singapore. That's a place I want to move to. And it's just one of those things where, yeah, exactly. But like if I go there, I'm going to have friends like you there. Cool. That's going to be great. But that's going to be a new experience. And I'm going to feel like I'm at my lowest point there. I have to build myself up in a new place. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. That's daunting.
Now, going back to a question here, how has your knowledge and experience grown into this width and depth format as in T-shape?
In what sense? What do you mean?
I guess growth hacking, growth marketing in a way.
I guess for me, even though I'm T-shaped, I'm still learning. So you can have like your T-shaped marketers who maybe are just content in terms of knowing 5 things and being an expert in one thing. For me, I'm continuously growing that T. So for some, it might be a very skinny T, like a short breath here on top and a very deep expertise. Mine is becoming longer and longer on top, just because the business world is changing so much. Everything is changing so much. So one of the things that I'm learning right now, I have been interested in analytics for a while. In my job, I could do a lot of analysis on my own, but I think there was a point in time where I'm like, oh my gosh, if I could just do this on my own without the help of an engineer or a data person, then my work would be so much easier. And so I'm actually learning really to become almost like a data scientist.
You have to
So
be,
that's
though.
Kind of like one of those. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I was pursuing a MicroMasters from MIT and edX, and I realized that when I was going through it, I didn't know enough statistics and data science to really pursue it. But when I started pursuing data science after that, I realized that, oh, well, this translates into marketing as well, understanding analytics. And on top of that, it translates into so many other different fields too. If you know data science, especially, I think that's one area that's like really in every cookie jar, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah.
That reminds me of a point you made earlier. I don't even know if you mentioned it much, but like the transferable skills. When you have that wide width, you have more to pull from when you have like a wicked problem. Most people face problems that are repeatable, such as a task you have to do at work. Okay, this task is really hard. Well, I know what to pull from to do it. Well, this is a task that even my colleagues can't figure out. Together, we can't even figure out. This wicked problem is something new and unknowable. It's too much of a mystery to really push through it. But when you have multiple areas to pull from, you're more likely to succeed with that wicked problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think because if you have so many experiences and you know quite a lot of things, you can basically try and apply all of those to a problem and then see if that works, right? It's almost like being able to have a room full of different people brainstorming for that. And that's one of the things that brainstorming sessions is trying to do, right? Is to get different people with different experiences and knowledge to think about the same problem. But if you're just one person and if you have all of this knowledge, it's kind of like having 10 people in your head trying to kind of like problem solve this thing. So yeah, I totally feel that.
That's awesome. And so it's interesting too, where we're talking about analytics. How can we get better than at goal setting and analytic targets, do you think?
Oh, wow. So this has been kind of like a question that I've had for so long, because at the beginning of this year, I wanted to pursue a master's in analytics. And then with this whole COVID thing, I decided I don't want to spend that money on another degree. I could probably still do it, still get the education that I need, but I'll DIY it, so to speak. Because I saw this guy, I think his name is David Venturi. So he used to be from Data Camp. He created his own DIY masters. And so I love that. And I think it kind of democratizes learning, which has been going on during this whole pandemic, right?
Okay.
And I thought, yeah, why don't I do it? So the way that I am approaching now my learning for analytics is to kind of like see what's the curriculum out there, and you would get this in any of the schools that you might be interested in. And then I'm trying to map that out in some of those MOOC courses online and see if there's an equivalent. So that's kind of like how I'm doing it. I probably wouldn't be able to put together like a learning plan on my own because I don't know what I don't know, right?
Yeah.
So I have to kind of like borrow from what's the curriculum out there, and can I copy it, and can I make it better?
So I need to plug myself here because, like I mentioned earlier, the first phase of my content, I'm not sure if you watched some of my older videos, is about this DIY degree, or as I call it, a modular degree. And so I couldn't actually find a degree that I wanted. I wanted to work in smart city development, and there was no degrees out there for it. And because of that, and that's a lot of data and science right there, I tell you what, but because of that, I had to make my own. And so I started out with like 400 MOOCs and had to cut it down and stuff like that. And now it's around 100. So it's plenty more palatable, but even that is insane. And in my journey for this, I found people, I actually haven't heard about that guy you mentioned, so I need to look into him a bit more. Maybe you can send me a link afterwards. But there's Scott Young, who did his MIT challenge. And this was before MOOCs, mind you. It was like 2011 or something like that, where he took the curriculum of an MIT computer science degree and got all the textbooks, watched OpenCourseWare, which is like the precursor to MOOCs, and various other sources, and pursued that 4-year degree in a 1-year time span. And he was successful.
So crazy.
Yeah. Well, he was able to fund himself, I think, from some other kind of endeavor, something like that. But it was fascinating how he did it. And there's other people like that. People no pay, Lori Picard's no pay MBA, where she made her own MBA through MOOCs. And so what I've been trying to do is create this modular degree platform where people like yourself who want to pursue something like that can go on and make a system like that, like you're trying to say, like a executable plan.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I follow Scott Young. I mean, being the curious person that I am, what do you call it? Polymath? No, Multipotentialite. Yeah. When you mentioned that, I had to go and get Scott's ultra learning course because I thought if I really want to learn, I have to learn it from the guy who has made learning kind of like his superpower, right? Yeah. So just so that I could supercharge a lot of the learning that I'm trying to do. So yeah, I think I got the idea not just from that David guy, but because I was going through Scott's course, he did mention his MIT challenge. But obviously when I was thinking, it was like, a 4-year course, it sounds like a full-time job.
Yeah, well, it was for him. That's the thing. He had the time to do it and the financial structure to be able to do it. And I think for what you're doing, you don't need to do that much work. It would only be a year's worth of schooling that you would probably need to be successful with your amount of skills and knowledge. From what I can tell right now off of you, I think a year's worth of schooling, which will probably equal about like a month's worth of courses or something like that, you know what I mean, spread out over time, like 30 days worth, like that many hours, so to speak. So I think that you'll be able to do it pretty well. It's really fascinating. I didn't realize that's what you were trying to do. It's perfect. Like you're a perfect persona for what I'm building there.
Perfect. Yeah. So if you have questions, we can kind of like bounce some ideas off me. But yeah, I totally love to know how you progress with that.
Yeah, I'll show you what my modular degree later. Yeah, and that's fascinating. So like, how can we stay committed to our goals? And like my modular degree or your modular degree for data science there, how can we stay committed?
Staying committed and motivated. That's the biggest question.
Yeah.
I just kind of came out of a very big slump. So I've spent the past 3 weeks kind of just like on my couch watching Netflix and kind of like trying to figure out, okay, what shall I do with my life? Is this still something that I want to do? And I guess maybe when I think about it, it's kind of like being good to ourselves, offering us that grace to kind of like feel the low lows when it happens. So when you do feel a slump, when you think like, oh, I don't have motivation, I feel like for a lot of us, and for myself specifically, I tend to put shame with that experience. But what I'm trying to do now is just to understand, like, this is a normal part of the experience of my journey, and it's okay to not always be so like, oh, I'm going to go out there every day and I feel like great every day. Kind of just be okay to know that there are some days where my motivation level is just really not there. But in terms of really goal setting, I think what has helped me, to be honest, is to really understand why I'm doing something. So for example, for my podcast, when I started it, it was really just a side project. I wasn't trying for it to become a side hustle or anything like that. And I wasn't trying to be the next Joe Rogan, although that would be great.
Yeah.
Not saying that I don't want that, but it just wasn't kind of like the the metric that I was measuring myself with. So really understanding my why and understanding what makes it worthwhile. So these are some of the questions that I've had to think for myself, and something that I've also shared with a lot of my mentees for the podcast scholarship that I was a part of. So I've told them that you really need to understand why you're doing your podcast or whatever project that you're doing or any endeavor that you're doing, because when things get low, you have to be able to kind of go from there knowing that what you're doing is kind of like bigger than yourself. So for me, I really wanted to do it because I felt like this was, the conversations that I'm having with my guests is super important. And as much as, when I think about it, I could be like, oh yeah, even if I stop it, nobody would miss it, or something like that. Or it's going to take a while before this becomes something viable financially. But at the end of the day, for me, it's more of like, one, I'm able to really speak to a lot of amazing women, as I've been able to speak to my heroes as well. So that was really great. And that to me is one of the things that has kept me going,
Yeah.
And then the other one is really understanding that these are conversations that are important to have. And for me, I've heard a lot from other women who just message me on social media or drop me an email to say that they really enjoyed the show. They've learned so much and they understand what I'm trying to do. So if you know all of those, not so much as like, oh, I want to be famous or I want to make $100. Those are great goals to have in terms of metrics and numbers, but you really have to understand why you're doing it. Kind of like something that's more of like the softer side of things. So
Yeah.
not like I want to get so many subscribers or so many listeners or all of those things, but like why do I want that? Like, for example, if I want to earn money for my podcast, like why am I doing it? So to me, it's probably because so that I could, have the life that have control of my schedule, because for me, it's important to have ease and kind of like freedom in my day. And that's important to me. So basically the podcast is just a way for me to earn my keep, right? But I'm not just doing it for the money. So there's
a big
other
reason.
exactly. So I think if you know that, then you can stay motivated. But like if you're asking for very crucial things, well, I love using a lot of tools. So I have Notion. I've kind of like, have you heard of the PARA method?
Yep.
PARA. Yep. So
Second
I've
brain.
kind of like, second brain. I'm doing the second brain right now.
I know something better even.
What?
I know something better even.
Really?
Yeah, I'll tell you about it later, but yeah.
Okay. So yes, I've been doing kind of like, I've been really trying to organize and make sure that the projects that I'm really working on right now are the most important. So, being a multi-potentialite, we can get distracted by a lot of things. To be honest, like right now, I'm interested to dive into a few other topics. I'm like, okay, Nikki, hang on a second. Kind of like reel myself in and like, okay, for the next few months, I'm just going to focus on these 3 or 4 big projects. I'm going to break it down. And then I really want to understand what are the top 3 things that I need to do per week that is going to move me towards those goals. So for example, I like to kind of like take a big hairy goal and break it down per quarter, per month, and then per week. And just kind of like make sure that whatever it is I'm doing leads to that. So, we can get bogged down by a lot of busy work every day. So to me, even if my task list is like 100 different tasks a day, I just put the 3 things that I need to achieve today. Like whatever else I do beyond those 3 is gravy. They're like a bonus point. Yeah. But if I don't do these 3 things, I feel sad.
They're your top priority.
Exactly. Yeah.
So there's a lot of that to go off of there, Nikki. I love tangents like that. And just so I mentioned it, August Bradley, he is a Notion YouTuber. He talks about his pipes, pillars, and vault system. And so it's more effective from what I've learned from him than the para method. And I hope that people who like the para method don't get offended by that. But what I've been doing actually is literally watching every single one of his videos and every other person's Notion videos online as well. I actually made a playlist. I'll put that in the description for people listening. I'll send it to you later. I think you'll love it. But Notion,
can you explain the pipes? What's it?
Pipes,
vaults,
pillars, and vaults. And so I'm actually still learning it myself. I don't know if I know it well enough to explain it simply. I'm hoping to get August on the show here soon, actually, which would be kind of fun. But essentially speaking, you have your pillars of your pillars of life. You have your business, your health, your finance. Those are the areas that you need to focus on. You're not going to like do daily stuff with it per se. Yeah, that's the areas like, hey, I need to work on my workout habits. Like you were saying, you were in a slump. That's one thing I wanted to touch on. And so that's going to be something that you'll have to focus on, so to speak. And your pillars are that's the pillars. The pipes are the connections between the two. And what are you doing? What are the tasks you're doing? Like you're saying, breaking it down to 3 main tasks, that sort of thing. And then the vaults are like the databases. Where are you storing all those tasks? What are the weekly schedules? Are you keeping track of all your habits? So one thing I really think about, I like this PPV system, or is this Notion life operating system, as he says, is that it keeps track of all the little habits that you do. You have to manually input it, obviously, but like checking it off here and there, like I did my workout today, perfect. And then you get a big picture view of like, hey, this month I only did 15 days of working out. I'm really doing poorly there. So yeah, that's my understanding currently of that. It's really fascinating though.
Okay, I'll look into that. Sounds something that I'd be interested in.
Yeah. Well, and I'm excited to, after this recording, nerd out with you with Notion now, because I love Notion. In fact, I'm looking at Notion right now at our questions here. And one thing I was going to mention too is that I completely agree with what you said when it comes to like, you have to know what your why is. You have to understand where you're going to really pull yourself through the mud when it gets really bad. But one thing I'm really empathetic about is that I was lucky. I'm not sure about you, but I knew what I wanted to do, or at least somewhat, pretty early on. And I was able to evolve that over time. But some people just have no idea what they want to do. And because of that, they feel a little bit lost. But I do think they can follow our path of creating content and doing things. But when you do that without a why, you're more likely to crash and burn. But if you do it and just kind of stick with it, make 100 videos, as some of these creators say, make 100 videos, make 100 podcasts, and stick with it for that point. Generally, something's going to come out of that. You're going to test a whole bunch of different areas, throw these hands in different cookie jars, and eventually something might stick.
Yeah, I totally see what you're getting at, where, you know, the advice is just start something and do something. But if you don't know your why, you could easily burn out. So I totally feel that sentiment. But at the same time, there's also the other side of it, is that if you just do something, you'll probably find what you're looking for just by the act of doing something, right? So I totally feel that. That is quite tough, because you have the potential of kind of like coming across what you could be doing just by doing something. But then if you don't really know the why for it, then that's a dangerous path, or the fast track to burnout.
Yeah. Well, and take a positive view of it too. Some Eastern quotes of like, a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. And so even if you don't know where you're going, where the journey take you, just taking a step forward, making that podcast, making a few episodes. If it fails, you tried, and you know you tried, so you have no regret in that. And then they say that one often finds their destiny on the path they take to avoid it. And so eventually you're going to probably find it anyways, but if you could try to accelerate that, I think is really key and really more fun in a way.
Yeah. Now that I'm thinking about it, like, is there a way for us to help people who just, you know, don't know what they're doing, but they want to try? I feel like what you said, just the act of doing something really helps. I feel like when I'm stuck and I just sit on my couch, which is really bad, but it's actually when I'm doing something where suddenly all of the ideas come, right? Or kind of like this whole notion of, so I'm also a writer, and one of the things that I've had for the past few years is that I felt like I was blocked. But actually, it's not for the lack of ideas, it's for the lack of doing it. So to me, correct, consistency. But there was so much pressure to write something really amazing off the bat. So I've tended not to write. But you know what I've done this year, 2020, is I've decided to write my morning pages. Do you know morning pages? So 3 pages, but it kind of like leads to 750 words per day. And I just started writing, not because I have something grand to say or want to write essays every day. It was more of getting into the habit of embodying writing. So for me, I felt like the block was not in my head, but in my body. You understand? So after I've been doing it for more than 200 days now consecutively, more than 200 days now. Now when I sit down, thank you. Now when I sit down, my body knows how it feels like to write. and my head can kind of like flow through
Mm-hmm.
that sensation, versus previously where, because I felt like there was this high barrier of writing, I don't write. So now I just write stupid shit in
That's
my
fine. That's
750
fine.
words.
That's the whole
And it
point.
doesn't matter. Exactly. The point is just, kind of like feel what it feels like to write, even if what I'm writing is utter garbage.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
oh man, I already know this interview is going to be powerful for people to listen to, and there's so many things I can go off of what you said there. First thing first, Seth Godin writes every day, and he has been for like 2 decades now, essentially at this point. And
It's
I was
so
watching
crazy.
I know. I tried doing every day, and when I started blogging back in 2011, 2012, I was much more consistent then than I was now, and I'm a much better writer now. One thing you mentioned twice now are kind of some James Clear's Atomic Habits kind of quotes that I'm thinking of. And one thing you mentioned just now was this idea of context switching. So for example, if you get into the habit of putting on your headphones and going for a walk, the act of putting on your headphones gets you in the mindset of listening to podcasts, for example. So you start associating that action with that habits, and those habits become a routine for you in a way. It's just the connections of the brain happening for you. So the moment you sit down to write, your brain's activating and going into writer mode. So you are training your writer mode. And that's one thing I wanted to exemplify there. It's fascinating. I love it.
Yeah. To be honest, I was a bit skeptical about this whole thing because I've heard so many people talk about this three pages, morning pages by what's her name? Cameron something, right? The Artist Way. And a lot of people were just espousing like, oh, it's so powerful. I'm like, yeah, okay, really. And so I decided to do it this year because I really wanted to get back into my writer self. And the more that I did it, the more. So now I'm kind of like, yes, guys, I totally believe it now. It's totally true. You have to try it. Yeah. But it took a while to get there.
Yeah, and then one other thing was mentioned, you mentioned Power Method earlier, and something you mentioned just now, I don't remember exact words it was, but the whole thing about the Power Method and even PPV that I mentioned too, is that the idea of the input and output. And once you sit down to actually work on the execution of that output, like you're saying, that writing, whether it's good or bad, it's just a matter of going from point A to point B. And the habit that we're talking about is that transition between the two. And that's what's really hard. That's the difference between the successful and non-successful.
Yeah. And I think as well, like, so I have a love-hate relationship with social media. And I think that's one of the stresses that we have is that if we want to create something, we always think that when we create something, we have to share it. It's like, if you didn't post it, did it even happen?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it doesn't really allow for our creative selves to create something. And when you think about, being a creator, you're almost like a child because you're creating something new. It's kind of like a bit raw. And it's at that stage where it's actually not ready to be shared with the world because you're trying to protect what you're creating.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like nowadays people always think that if I'm creating something, I might as well post it or earn money from it or, all of those things. But at the end of the day, it's okay to create even if nobody's seeing it. It's just kind of like a practice, I guess, for now. And then maybe later on, you'll be able to create something that's more shareable to the world. So I feel like a lot of people don't even allow themselves to create just for the sake of the enjoyment or the practice, even if nobody sees it, even if they don't have an audience. Yeah. And I feel like it's because of social media that we feel like we have to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and as content creators, I feel like it's a normal habit as well. So going back to the questions here, because I know that you and I both will keep going down these tangents that are fascinating. But one thing you mentioned too is that we both see you as a multipotentialite. And so what does that term then mean to you?
I really love that term because it almost says like for every person has different potentials. It's kind of like what we were discussing earlier is that a lot of people don't like to be boxed in or trying to niche down. And I think like being able to understand like, oh, actually, I don't have to stick to one profession or just do one thing because I can express myself. I have the potential to express myself in different ways. And that's totally cool. So I love that. It kind of like removes the pressure of having to be one thing. So to me, it's really, it speaks a lot about the potential of a person to be able to do a lot of things, but it also allows us to just go after the things that we're interested in without the fear of having to create something out of it. Obviously, if you want to, then it's great, but it's kind of like the permission slip we needed.
Yeah, it removes the barriers, what I was thinking from your words there. And I don't know if I have any questions based around this or not, but I have this idea of this polymath spectrum. I might have mentioned it in one of the emails we had, where basically I think the people who are more multidisciplinary are either going to be T-shaped like yourself there, or trying to be more polymathic like I'm trying to be. I don't consider myself a polymath. I'm not an expert enough to be considered a polymath, but I'm polymathic in a way. And this idea of a polymath spectrum is this leveling of competency and knowledge. And I think multipotentialites are the start of that. They have the potential for these different areas. And when I say like a spectrum or the start, people might think, oh, that means they're not as good. But I think multipotentialites are awesome because that's, like you said, the potential to do many things. If you want to stay a multipotentialite your whole life, then so be it. That's okay. It's just the beauty of that curiosity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not that you start off as a multipotentialite and then move on to become a polymath. Like being a polymath is not the expert
Ultimate
level,
goal.
right?
Yeah,
Correct. That's not the goal. It's more of like you said, it's a spectrum. So you can either fall on the one end where you're trying kind of like you're the jack of all trades, and then on the other side is like you're an expert in a lot of things, and it's okay to kind of like fall in that. And I'm sure maybe a lot of polymath, maybe after a time, they just want to go back to just exploring a lot of things, and maybe they move into a time of their life when they're more of a multipotentialite because they're just exploring a lot of things. I don't know. Could
no,
be.
and one thing you mentioned there, actually, that what I think is kind of fascinating is that when I thought of spectrum, I was thinking two-dimensionally, point A to point B. When you explained that just now, you had 3 points, A, B, and C, and you made it three-dimensional in a way to me. And I was like, wow, I didn't think about it like that. That's one reason why I love having these interviews, because it makes me think differently. But because I do believe that specialists are important, and just because my niche is polymathy, people might think that like, oh, polymaths are better. It's like, sure, in some ways, yeah, but we need specialists. We need T-shaped people as well, and the multipotentialite's kind of the bridge between all that. Multipotentialites can silo down if they want to. Sometimes they just need to experiment enough to find what that silo is. In fact, David Epstein in his book Range talks about how some of the greatest specialists are the ones that dabbled the most when they were young.
Yeah. I have that book on my Kindle. I should really read
it. I've been really digging into it because I want him on my show. So I've been watching every podcast interview by him and reading all the articles, all that stuff. But how have you become a multipotentialite then? How did you discover yourself in that curious person?
I found it because I was at a point in my life back then where I didn't know what I was doing. I think we kind of like go through that experience, especially when you're starting out in your career, where, you know, if you look at all of these people like, oh, what am I doing with my life? Like, why haven't I found that thing yet? And there was so much pressure for me to be something. And I found multipotentialite because I needed something to hold on to, like, hey, this is okay. And so when I saw that term, I just hung on to it for dear life because it soothed a part of my psyche where I was so stressed, and just told me like, hey, Niki, it's okay if you don't know what you're doing right now. Just kind of like go with the flow and then see where it takes you. So that's kind of what I've been doing these past few years. It's just like, okay, I want to do this, or no, or somebody tells me, oh, I have a really cool project, and if it's interesting to me and I feel like it's worth the spending 8 hours of my day working on those things, I'm like, oh yeah, sure, I'll join your team or your company. And because of that, my life has been so much richer.
Yeah, it's that self-awareness of once you understand yourself enough, then you can find that word that you resonate with and attach to it, like you said. And for you, it's multipotentialite. For me, it was more polymath. But regardless, these parallel paths of just pursuing what we feel comfortable with, I think that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Do you see then a correlation between your multipotentiality and your T-shaped marketing experience then?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I feel like probably a lot of people are multipotentialites that become growth marketers. It almost feels like growth marketing was created because a multipotentialite said like, hang on a second, I don't need to focus on something. I can just be all of these things, and I'll call it a T-shaped growth marketer. So I feel like the person who came up with that term, probably a multipotentialite, and decided like, enough is enough. I think I know all of these experiences, and it would be a great kind of like profile for me to be able to do marketing. So I feel like those two kind of like work together. Like you can't be a T-shaped marketer without being a multi-potentialite. Like they kind of like go hand in hand.
So a couple questions that spawned off of that. And I think in order for me to ask the question, I need to have you define this. Do you think growth marketing is the same or different as growth hacking?
They're almost the same. I think when it first came out, the term was growth hacking because people were basically really trying to find something. So I think at its infancy, it was called growth hacking. The first growth marketers were basically growth hackers. And obviously, as that industry matured, it became growth marketing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because what I'm thinking is that the growth marketing might be a little bit more of the focused aspects, whereas growth hackers are kind of loose cannons of, and I say that in a very positive way, loose cannons in a way of trying to find like the guerrilla tactics and guerrilla warfare, for example, whereas growth marketers are taking various growth hacks that they've learned in the past and strategizing it much more. Does that make sense then?
Yeah, I think, I think I get what you're saying for growth hacking. Sometimes it's even dark patterns, so to speak,
like dark posts or something like that.
Yeah, correct. Like black hat kind of like hacking stuff. But I guess you could make the distinction because then I guess it's more of just how technical that person is. So there are growth marketers who are kind of like me, who started off doing communications and all of those things, and who might know a bit of technical stuff to be able to kind of like execute a lot of the growth hacks that we want to do. But then I feel like there are really growth hackers who are probably engineers or developers in their past life and decided that they want to do marketing by putting a lot of their experience doing dev work into it. So I think that's where the hacking part of it came about. So I guess if we really want to differentiate the two, one is a bit more technical than the other one's kind of like,
strategic in a way. I was just curious because we were mentioning growth marketing, and I just wanted to think about it because the person who coined the term growth hacking is someone how I would presume to be like a multipotentialite or polymathic person. When I looked into that guy, I don't remember his name off the top of my head. I feel really
Sean
bad.
Ellis.
Sean Ellis, yeah, exactly. I had his friend Sean Shepard on my show. I knew Sean Ellis. Dang it.
They're both Seans?
Yeah, they're both Seans. I saw them side by side in a video. It was hilarious. They just bantered off each other too. It was great. No, but Sean Ellis, thank you. It was the tip of my tongue there. But Sean Ellis is someone who's like a multi-potentialite, someone who had the potential to do many things. And I think he spread his wings like that, like a jack of all trades in a way. And jack of all trades, not in a negative way. So I'm stealing a question you brought up beforehand now. How do we balance the breadth versus depth when it comes to our curiosity and focus?
This is something I'm struggling with still every day, but I think I've kind of understood what works for me. So I'm not saying this in terms of like, this is the best advice ever, but this is what I found has worked for me. So I noticed that in order for me to be able to do or be curious about many things is that in a year I have to focus. So this year I wanted to focus on my writing, I wanted to focus on my podcasting, and I want to focus on my business. All of those things. And then kind of have one learning experience. So for me this year was data analytics. And then the building a second brain is another one. So I've kind of like created I've had to choose 2 or 3 things to focus on per year and then kind of like choose 1 or 2 learning goals per year. So that's helped me make sure that I am continuously learning and kind of like deepening my experiences and at the same time allowing me that breadth. So let's say this year I'm really trying to be a writer, right? So I've done my 750 words. I'm trying to blog more. I'm trying to create more. And I'm hoping that at the end of the year, I have this habit. Like I've basically made it into a system that I can just kind of forget about, not really forget, but I know that I'm just going to do this almost automatically, and that allows me to go after newer things. So I've kind of like had to work through cycles, if that makes sense.
Oh my gosh, I love this so much. So it's funny how similar we are too, because that's exactly what I've been trying to do as well. I love how we're lifelong learning. Let's put that out there. Lifelong learning is super important. I think we both agree, and I just want people to hear that and just absorb that for a moment. But then one thing I don't know if you saw this or not, but one of my micro episodes last season was this idea of macro and micro focus, which is just what you mentioned there, where in the big picture, having the idea of where you want to go, but then micro focusing on what you need. And I think that's perfect for polymath, so people who are multidisciplinary on any part of the spectrum, basically, because like you can't do everything at once. And if you do, I'm still a holdout on the idea you can technically do everything at once, but you have to have a strategy and you have to do it well. And 99% of the people, and including probably myself, can't do that. Leonardo da Vinci is like someone is a good example who's someone who has did that. Did like 50 million things. Literally is an expert in 15 different fields. He's the one that I would presume to be like that. Everyone else needs to focus on something, then move on to the next thing, so to speak.
Yeah.
We're not a multitasking species. And I think it's fascinating how, by the way, Notion, I think, is perfect for that too. Tracking all those focuses. And one thing I've been trying to do, I mentioned earlier, is how I've been looking at everybody, including the para and second brain stuff, as well as the PPV, and I'm trying to combine them, try to find a way to make it all work together in a new system, so to speak.
Yeah.
So really interesting.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that you're in fitness, right? I actually got this idea of the cycles because of training. So I've been working out regularly since like 2013. And then, but even my training has evolved over the years. And I came across this company called GMB, and they recommend doing your training in cycles so that you can kind of like improve your skills and then learn new things at the same time. And they totally espouse this whole cycle thing. And I thought like, oh yeah, I totally get it, because at the end of the day, my body wouldn't be able to take so many different training programs, right? I'd have to focus. So I love that the cycle thing that they mentioned. And I thought, because I'm learning and it's also still my body, maybe it works the same way. Yeah. So I thought like, okay, let's just like gym for my brain, right?
Exactly. And one thing I really love about this episode already is that like I never get a chance to explain all the various facets of PolyInnovator to someone. And I think that right now it's actually prudent to you to do so, because I think that both of us are talking the same thing in the cycles. That's perfect. Because I talk about, as a personal trainer, the 3 variables of exercise: speed, intensity, and volume. And when you're changing one of those variables, that is the cycle that you're in for that week or day or month. Like maybe this month you're focusing on lifting heavier weights, or the next month you're focusing purely on cardio. Regardless of what the focus is, you're changing one of those variables in some sort of way. Either you're doing a jog for longer, which will be your volume, or maybe you're one of those people who wears a weighted vest when you're jogging. So that's in changing the intensity. And so it's one of those things where as someone who's worked at exercise for a long time, I can do those cycles pretty naturally, systematically in a way, but I know other people can't, not intuitively in a way. So I wanted to help people do that. I think what you're doing there's a prime example where you're changing it up like that, and that GMB people, like you said.
Yeah, totally. I feel like because at the end of the day, we're limited by our physicalness, right? Our body, and I've taken a lot of it from the fitness world, to be honest, just because I realized that my brain is part of my body, and I kind of like maybe have to approach it the same way.
Well, and if you don't take care of your brain, your body, or in yoga too, there's 4 areas. And so one thing I talk about is the 4 pillars philosophy: the mind, body, spirit, and emotions. If you don't take care of those, then you're not going to be able to pursue the things you want to, because they're going to drag you down too much.
Exactly. Yeah. Which is kind of like very different from what we see out there, right? Like this whole hustle culture. A lot of people don't sleep or work themselves to the ground. And for me, it's always like, if I'm trying to solve something and it's like 2 a.m., my brain is fried, I feel like if I just slept and then I wake up, I feel like I'm able to solve the problem so much faster. Sometimes it was staring me right in the face that whole time. And I just needed to sleep, have some rest, and then in the morning I'm so much fresher. But I've been in industries before in my career where I've had to push on 48 hours, which is so crazy. Like at some point I was like crying, like, what am I doing with my life? But you go.
I get what you mean. And one thing I think COVID's helping out a lot is this whole work from home mentality, where people started working in their own cycles. So circadian rhythm is very important to our work cycles, as I think you understand perfectly, but for people in the audience listening in, is that, like, for example, people are starting to work more in their own rhythm. They'll sleep in a little bit later because they can get away with it, and then get their coffee, and then their work actually dramatically improves because they're working at their prime hours. My hours are 10 a.m. and 10 p.m., which we're actually closely approaching here. What are your hours during the day?
So for me, I follow are you familiar with Ayurveda?
Yeah, a little bit.
Yeah. So I really start my day early, like around 7, and then I take that time to really get my body going, and then it suddenly clicks at 10 a.m. Suddenly I'm awake, I have more energy, and then yeah, exactly. And then at 2 is another burst of creativity. And then at 6 p.m. I kind of like start slowing down, and then at 10 p.m. that's when my brain is kind of like not working anymore. But if I stay up a little bit at 2 a.m., I'm going to get that burst of energy. So if I don't sleep between 10 or 2, I'm going to be awake from 2 onwards.
Yeah.
Yes, I have this window, like I have to sleep. Yeah.
Well, and I was researching sleep at one point for my own self-development, obviously, and I don't remember where I saw this, but they were mentioning that 2 a.m., I think that the other 2 points I think are related to your circadian rhythm. I think 2 a.m. one is more related to sleep cycles in a way, which obviously those are connected, because if you miss your first sleep cycle, which starts around 10 p.m., then that prevents you from getting into REM when you go back into it later on. Something like that. And so when you get to that 2 a.m. point, your brain had missed that cycle, so it just decides to wake up anyways.
Yeah, and I think that's why whenever I sleep around 3 a.m., I wake up super tired because I didn't get that initial kind of like cycle at the beginning, the 10 p.m. cycle. Yeah.
Well, and
I feel like the theme of this conversation are cycles.
Yeah, honestly, it's going to probably be the name of it, the cycles of a T-shaped marketer or something like that. But no, what's interesting too is that there's multiple kinds of cycles. And so when you're sleeping, REM is what everyone thinks about, but even the micro sleep cycles in between are super important for various other purposes in your body. So I think REM is good for the memory and storing things and deep repair. But one of the earlier ones is good for the lymphatic system, for example, or something like that. And so this is just fascinating stuff. Yeah. Do you know about sleep chronotypes?
No.
Okay. So it's kind of like an expansion idea of the early bird and night owl. And some people need more sleep. Some people need less sleep. It's just something that's been not proven 100% yet, but is interesting to note nonetheless.
Yeah. I mean, I really know a lot of people who are just night owls. Like, even if I tell them, oh, you should follow the Ayurveda cycle, I feel so much better that way. But I realize that maybe I'm more attuned with this kind of cycle, and they're so much better after midnight for some reason.
Well, when we were talking, our time difference, like it's what, 10 a.m. for you over there, 11, something like that. And for me, it's 9:40. And so it's like, I'm about to approach one of my other peaks during the day, that's 10 p.m.
Yeah.
So this conversation is going to get a whole nother level here in a little bit. But going back to the questions here, so I can somewhat keep us on track. Something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
Oh, wow. So the thing is, I've heard the term polymath, but I haven't really thought about it until, you told me that you were going to ask me this question. And so to me, I feel like a polymath is somebody who has knowledge in a lot of things, but also is an expert in a lot of those areas. Yeah.
Yeah.
So to me, that's what a polymath is. Even the fact that there is math in the word is sort of like, wow, this person is such a smart person.
Yeah. Well, and I interviewed someone who had polymath in their name, and this guy Ronnie, he was super funny because he looked at the word polymath, and he works as a CGI. He built a CGI company, and they work in polygons and mathematics to build the CGI. So he's like, it's a perfect combination, but even though it had nothing to do with what he's talking about, although he is a multidisciplinary person, so is a lot of his teammates. And so it made sense, but it was just one of those things where people see polymath and they think, oh, mathematics. Oh, no, never mind.
Yeah.
But I often ask what my guest's perspective is on that. And I think that also relates partially to your principles of life that I asked before the show as well. So, and we'll touch on yours in the various questions, but what is this idea of, we both had that problem. I'm going to cut that part out. I can't speak. What is your profound vision of bridging together the idea of arts and science? What are your thoughts on that kind of thing, do you think?
I love this question. I really, really love this question because I feel like I am the person that, and I guess a lot of polymath, multipotentialite feel that art and science should be art and science. It's not a dichotomy. Like, we're not just supposed to be doing art. We're not just supposed to be science. And I feel like a lot of, so when I think of science, for example, I feel right now I'm just using the example of, let's say, programmers, right? A lot of the science part of it. But I feel like a lot of good programmers are creative in themselves. To be honest, I've met a lot of programmers who are very musically inclined as well. And I feel like that makes them really good programmers at the same time. And then you have people that say like me who are in the arts, but I have a science streak because I love analytics, right? And that's helped a lot in the way that I view my work and all of those things. So I feel like it's not so much as trying to divide people and say like, oh, you should only do science or you should only do art, but it's really bridging the two. And I don't even know how this whole thing started. Like, I think it must be a university where I know in the British system, they've had to separate students into streams, the art stream and the science stream. And I'm in my head, I'm like, that is crazy because I grew up having to learn both. Right. But I think in the British system, they've only had to focus on, if you are put on the science stream, then you're learning a lot of science subjects. And then people in the arts are just learning a lot of art subjects, but never both, which to me is a little crazy. I don't know exactly because I wasn't brought up in the British school system, but I know in the US system, you can kind of like learn a lot of things at the beginning. In university, you get to do a lot of the generic subjects and dabble onto something. And I think it's not until second or third year of your university that you start specializing, right?
Yeah, I still feel like that universities in US and UK both are very specialist centric in a way though. And I mean that both in the general sense of like just learning many different things or just learning one thing, but also what you're saying there, science or arts. And it's like, but you need both. And one thing I noticed in the US is the rise of liberal arts degrees, partially because the people want to be more interdisciplinary. And it's like, why don't we just, that's why I made the bachelor's degree too, is for people like us who want to do both.
Yeah. I mean, I have a liberal arts degree and it always felt like something, it almost felt like a second class citizen amidst all of the doctors and lawyers and scientists and now engineers and programmers. But I'm glad that there's kind of like this whole renaissance again where they're like, oh yeah, arts is so much better.
Well, and I blame it on the internet too. And I think COVID's actually helping out a lot. Like with all the negative aspects, there's also the positive opportunities of like people like us coming together. Like this probably wouldn't have happened had I not made a COVID resolution of sorts to do these interviews. And so I bring that up too. So like, what would be your COVID or what has been your COVID resolution in a way?
For me, it's my writing because I kind of like put that as a challenge to myself this year is to write every day. So I have been doing that. But with everything crazy going on in the world, for me, it's my routines. For some reason, I love having my morning routine, so having exercise. So that's kind of like been my anchor. Yeah. If I don't do my morning routine, I feel like a lost person.
But yeah, it brings you back into yourself. And I think that every time we wake up, we're almost like a new person in a way every day. And so having that anchor brings you back to who you are truly.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, actually, this leads me to the next question. I'm just going to ask this real quick then. How can you bridge together then your love of creating and your love of data science and data analytics, both of those passions together, like your ikigai of sorts?
Yeah, I feel like for a lot of the things I'm doing, so for example, my podcasting and in my work as a growth marketer, being able to look at data has informed a lot of my hunches. You know, so I think at work and in the things that we do, you're like, oh, I just feel like this is the right thing. Like I can feel it in my bones. Like I can feel the trend. Like sometimes technically in a way, right? Because we're consumers, we're, reading a lot of things online, watching a lot of things. You can kind of like pick up on what the trends are, but it's nice to be able to confirm that fact by looking at data. So I love having to be able to use a bit of my intuition as kind of like the initial point and then verify that with the data. But obviously it's not always perfect. Sometimes there's no data because it's so new. And I guess that's the point where you just kind of like have to see how it goes.
Yeah. Well, and I think me and the audience both could learn a lot from you, Niki. That's one of those things too where I feel like you're ahead on this path. That's great.
That's maybe because I'm older.
Not like 2 years, something like that. From like curiosity and travel, then there's a lot of potential chances in your life to live the fulfilled life that you're mentioning there. How have you tried to embrace that? so to speak? He's touched on that a bit, but
Fulfilled life. I guess it's a lot of things. So to me, when it comes to, you mentioned principles, right? So for me, I've been thinking about this is what is the most important for me in my life and also in my career. Because if I think about it, my career can be somewhat stressful doing growth marketing for startups, for big companies. For me, the most important thing is having ease. So I've kind of like had to make a lot of decisions based on, will this thing give me ease in whatever way that I feel ease should be in my life, whether that's in my schedule or in the work itself or whatever. So I've kind of like used that as my benchmark in a lot of decisions that I've made. But I've also tried to surrender to whatever is happening and really just go with the flow. I feel like for the past few years, and just based on what's going on in entrepreneurship where it's all hustle, 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 I feel it almost feels like when we think of success, we have to be striving so much to do something. Like we're always after something and kind of like forcing ourselves into a situation or an image or an ideal. So to me, I've kind of like had to take a step back and just really sort of understand ease for me and how can I include that ease in terms of my decision making. So I've had to let go of a lot of the struggle that I found, like for example, for my podcast, like, oh, I want it to be successful. I want this, I want this, I want this. And it just, every day I'm just kind of like pushing and pushing and pushing. And then I'm just exhausted. Right. So I've kind of just, for a lot of the things that I'm interested in and in my work and the things that I want to do, like my morning routines and all of that, I've had to really introduce ease into different aspects of it. So to me, that's really kind of like helped it, because at the end of the day, everything that I do, even if I don't have a why, I know that whatever it is I do, I want to feel at ease with a lot of those things. So I guess a lot of my decision making goes with my body and my intuition and how I feel in certain things. If I feel a little bit of contraction in a decision, or if I meet somebody, or for example, now that I'm, let's say, possibly looking for clients or jobs, if I feel a little bit of contraction talking to them, I know like, okay, something's not right and maybe this isn't the path for me. So I've had to just really let go of a lot of things. And especially with everything that's happening right now, we have no control. Like, who knew 2020 is going to be like this? So I'm just kind of like, okay, all of my plans, they're still there, but I'm not going to
push it back a little bit.
Yeah. Like I'm not going to force it if it's not there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Niki, what I'm getting from you here, and tell me if I'm wrong, is the whole idea of like the balance of hustle. Like you want to work on stuff too, but you also have that ease. And something you alluded to earlier is like kind of almost the idea of synchronicity, finding that path and understanding that systematic thinking. I feel like we're both systematic thinkers and intuitive people. And because of that, you have that ability to just read people pretty well and read situations well. And I think it's perfect for data science then, because you can read those connections, those systems there. But Hakuna Matata, like it means no worries. Like sometimes you have to have no worries in that. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. It's hard. It's like a practice. Some days, today I feel like super at ease. The past 3 weeks for me has been a lot of contraction, to be honest. And I think that's why I just try to lie down in my sofa and trying to ease a lot of the stresses away. But yeah, so it's not something that I am good at. It's always something that I have to constantly work on every day. And there comes a time where sometimes I even forget. Like I've been in situations where I take on a project or I take on a new job at a company where at the end of the day, it didn't bring a lot of ease into my life. And I've had to really kind of like, hang on a second. I think I need to change.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So it's not always a perfect system.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot of things that people can learn from what you just said there. And I'm getting a lot of Taoist vibes from that as well. And speaking of like balance and Taoism, there's a book I think you'll like called The Tao of Physics, where it's like a balance of arts and science. And so
Okay.
I can
I
send you
love
links
that already.
Yeah. But it's one of the things too where just finding that balance, that coming together is something that's hard. And when you get thrown off balance, I think going back to the 4 pillars analogy that I mentioned earlier, like those are something you're trying to build up over time, but they're going to get impacted by external events. If you get sick, your health, your mind, your spirituality even maybe can get like affected by that. Your emotions, for example. I woke up this morning not feeling great. Obviously right now we're both having a great time. So today ended up being a good day. but like
Yay.
but my pillars got out of balance. So, and I had to find ways to recuperate that and take ease and not work on the stuff I was planning on doing because I wasn't ready for it. I had to save the energy for this too. And COVID is something that has hit everybody. The health pandemics hit everybody in a way like, hey, our hustle culture is not going to work in this situation. We had to give ourselves a little bit of ease, a little bit of transition time. The first 2 weeks threw everybody off. My system of working out relied on me working at the recreation place that I worked at. When I stopped working out because of that system and habit got thrown out the window. And so it's like, I was used to it more than most people, and I got thrown out. And so it gave me empathy for people who weren't as commonly working out as much as you or I. And it's like, okay, they might need to have a little bit more of a transition time and relax more, ease more into it, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this whole pandemic has, in a way, not only allowed ourselves to rest, you know, I feel like it's a collective global resting period for all of us. And it's also allowed us to kind of like go back into our creative side. I mean, who knew that it was a pandemic that's going to get a lot of people started on baking?
Yeah. I learned how to cut my hair. Did you learn any new skills too?
I learned how to cut my hair. So the hair that you're seeing now, I cut it.
Looks good. Looks good. Yeah.
Thank you. Yours too. Yeah. So I now that we were talking about art and science earlier. Well, science has really kind of like been the backbone for the past few years because of the rise of the internet and the technology and all of those things. But it's during these times where it's pandemic where we actually need art, because I think it's the only thing that's really soothing us at the moment.
Yeah. So with all your communications and global travel experience too, we're talking about travel there, you have this global network built up. What have you learned from your peers and professional connections?
Oh, wow. Sometimes when I think of network, I feel like I don't have any, but I think it's just by virtue of having been working for a long time that I've had to build up that network. But one of the things that I realized over time is that even though we have a lot of these connections, loose connections online, especially with social media, LinkedIn, all of those things, you still have to find a way to make it more personal. So even though, let's say, I might have like more than 1,000 or 2,000 people on LinkedIn, I don't know all of them. I only really stick to a couple of people that I really know, somebody who can really vouch for my work or somebody who can really vouch for my character. So over the years, I've also noticed kind of like the people who are really keeping an eye on me. So even though I don't have official mentors, I know that there are some people who are much older than me, more experienced, who have been kind of just like looking at what is Niki up to these days, right? And it's kind of like being able to reciprocate those relationships. But I think with everything going on now, I've kind of found a way to be able to connect with people online. Kind of like, right now we found each other online. I've tried to be more open into doing these online networking things. Have you heard of Lunch Club?
It sounds familiar, but please explain.
Yeah, so basically you join this platform and then you get paired up every week to meet how many people you like with different kind of like goals or profiles. So it really depends on how many slots in a week that you would like to offer for these meetings. And then so I've tried to be more consistent in that, because nowadays there's just no chance for us to organically bump into people. So I've had to not real organically bump into them online. But even then, I'm hardly as active on social media. And so platforms like Lunch Club has made, these kind of like connections possible. I was able to reconnect to somebody who was introduced to me in person, but we've never connected afterwards. We got connected on Lunch Club, and then now he's brought me clients. He's helped, become kind of like an advisor for me when I was starting out my business and all of those things. So it's kind of like amazing how when we think of connection online, sometimes we always feel like, oh, it's all small talk or it's not as deep as we want. But I guess we also get how much we put into it. And I've kind of like had to make peace with this whole concept of networking for myself. I might not like that term networking, but I've learned what it means for me and how it is authentic for myself. And so I've kind of like found a way of being able to do that online or offline and make sure that it feels genuine to myself.
Well, and just being able to make those authentic connection, so to speak. And
Yeah.
we both met on Matchmaker.fm, the
Yes. Oh,
podcast
yeah.
platform. And
Correct.
ironically, that's what sparked my COVID resolution that I mentioned earlier, doing these interviews, because I always wanted to. Like, I had a podcast for years, but it was always solo before that. And having tools like you mentioned
Mm.
in Matchmaker too, it's one of those things where it sparked. I just talked to some random person. Like, it was organic. Like, I literally saw him, he saw me, we just started talking. He became my first guest, Dale Brockta. It was super cool. And
Oh, so cool.
and then since then, like I told you at the beginning, you're my 51st guest. And
For this year alone?
since May. Since May. Not even this year,
You're
but
on
since May.
fire.
Thank you. And I've been on like a dozen different other shows as well. So it's like
Oh, that's so cool.
but it's like at least 40 of those have been from Matchmaker alone too. It's just one of those things where being able to have these conversations, like I already know that you and I are going to get along great now. Like we have so these great things in common. We both love Notion, which is just, I love Notion so much. I moved everything to there. And it's one of those things where like, if we talked, I was like, okay, cool. We have some things in common. We'll add each other on LinkedIn. Cool. Like you said, kind of go out the window and maybe talk to each other every few months or so. But like now that we've made a visual connection, seeing your face, seeing my face, it's going to be more powerful. And so if I ever do move to Singapore, I'll be like, Niki, and you'll be like, that's it. It'll be perfect.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's really great out there to kind of like put, I mean, for me, I'm quite an introvert. So when I first joined Lunch Club and just committing to at least meeting one person a week has helped a lot in kind of like just putting myself out there.
That's good.
But for you, 51, that's crazy.
I'm more of an extrovert anyways too. So that's interesting. I always like knowing that because I never know. You can't tell. Like you have a great persona when you're on camera here, obviously. So it's like, okay, cool. Like she's chatty. I wouldn't have known you were an introvert, so to speak.
Yeah, after this call, I need to lie down on my sofa.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm more of an ambivert. I think even after this call, I'm going to like sit there and meditate. Like, what did we all talk about there? So we will wrap up here somewhat soon. But you have some really interesting workshops on your website. And one thing that particularly stood out to me was the whole Notion workshop, or Asana, really. This whole idea of run your podcast with Notion. And so I run this show and everything else through Notion. Do you mind giving a quick rundown, if you don't mind spoiling a little bit, on your training?
Yeah, for me, I use Notion. Well, to be honest, I've actually created this process and workflow on Asana first. And then it took a while for me to kind of like move them into Notion just because a lot of the stuff is on Asana already. But basically, I've been using Notion as a way to really create checklists. So if you think about how do we create podcast episodes, we're probably following the same steps. Every time. And for me, that takes up a lot of my brain space. And in order for me to free up a lot of those steps, I decided to just create a checklist. And in that way, I don't have to, did I send this guest the release form? Have I sent them this? I reach out to this person, but did they schedule already? So, like all of these questions, all of these little micro decisions that I've had to kind of like think of for every episode, and sometimes all happening at the same time with different guests. So Notion has kind of like been a lifesaver in terms of just keeping track of all of these connections that I'm having online, pitching guests, which part of that stage they're at. Have they scheduled something? Have I sent them the questions yet? Have they sent me their photos? All of those things is all on a checklist. And then they get moved onto a production room because I feel like there are two workflows. One is on the guest side. It's just, I call it podcast guest CRM because I have to pitch them and then get them on the show and then go on from there. After the interview is done, there is another workflow, which is the podcast creation itself. So has it gone through the editing process? Do I need to review it? Do I need to cut out anything else afterwards? And that's just the podcast itself, right? Then there's another workflow where the distribution and promotion of it. Have I created social media images for it? Have I scheduled it in? Have I told my guests that it's coming out? Have I sent them the files? Have I sent them kind of like sample copy of how they can share it with their audience? So all of these things are happening, all different workflows, all have different steps and all of those. And I've kind of just created a system on Notion on how to go about that. And they all connect kind of all together with my scheduler. I know you use Calendly. I use Harmonizely. And then from there, I also used different tools in order to kind of like make that process more automated. Because when you're kind of like doing a podcast on your own, especially for myself, especially now, right, when people are kind of like empowered to start a podcast because it's so much easier. Sometimes they forget that while it's easy to set up, you just need a mic connected in your computer and then start recording, there's a lot of steps afterwards. And if you really want to make it successful, you kind of like have to create a system out of it. I could technically just sit down every day and then talk shit and then post that up, but that's not gonna it's not gonna be worthwhile after a long time. So I've really had to create processes in self. But I think at the end of the day, because I love routines, like I told you, my morning routine is kind of like what anchors me. Having this process in place in my podcast helps me make sure that none of the little pieces, I'm not dropping any of the balls because I have this process and workflow in place that will make sure that I do not drop any balls.
Yeah.
And so I have more brain space for the more creative side, like planning, strategically thinking of how to grow it.
Yeah, let me interject right there then too, because one thing you mentioned is the whole idea of a brain dump, which is the PAR method partially there too. And when I first started with Matchmaker, one of the first things I did was make a CRM, just like you said. I call mine the Polycast Guest CRM instead of Podcast Guest. But yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
It makes a world of difference. Like I knew I didn't want to keep track of all that. And just what's interesting, so you say you basically have 3 separate workflows. You have the pre, the during, and thereafter, essentially. I have mine all in just kind of one. So I'm curious to see how ours differentiates. And because I just have all the statuses in a row, and I'll change the status to what I need at that particular point. Like, hey, I sent you the questions. I'm going to change that status to ready then, because now we're ready to record. After this, I'm going to change it to interviewed. Okay, we're interviewed. Now I need to edit. And so it's interesting how you have that ability. And then with compound board views and calendar views, it does make it kind of easier to actually see it. One more thing is that like Notion's API, they've been saying it for a long time, it's hopefully coming out here soon.
Oh, cool.
And that would make things a lot easier for automation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you asked earlier about workflows. There's actually 3. But with Notion, the great thing about Notion is these relational databases. So I use it actually, so that technically I only create one thing, but they're all living in different kind of like pages by relationship and all of those things. So that's kind of like helped in a way reduce the process, at least on Notion itself. So it's basically just one big workflow broken down into 3, which look like for my production house, production workflow, that's more of a Kanban style. But for my podcast guest CRM, it's more of a checklist and just like a status update. So they're all kind of like in different stages.
But like I guess I kind of do something similar, not necessarily for the guests per se, but more of networking. So I actually have my page as the networking base, or that I call it, and then I have the shows that I'm going to be on there, and that one's more like a checklist, like you're saying there. Okay, I have the link right there, I have the show right there, cool. Check it off that we did it. Okay, cool. The next one, the podcast guest, that's the more complicated one. That's the one that has like everything kind of built into it. And then I have pending guests beneath that. I just made that recently because I had so many people who either canceled last minute or like we had to reschedule at one point. That's fine. But you rescheduled pretty quickly, so I just kept you on my main base. But some people haven't rescheduled yet, and that's fine. But like, okay, I don't want to put them in just the outreach post, like the cold outreach. Haven't talked to them in a while. So it's like a pending guest, so to speak. Yeah.
I have guests who I even have kind of like a column of people who've said who I pitched to but didn't hear from, and then there are some people who I pitched to but were busy, and so I've kind of like, for you, they're kind of like pending because I think they want to be on the show but it's not the right time, so definitely will reach out. But I have a bucket of people I haven't pitched to, people I've pitched to but haven't heard from, people I've pitched to, heard from but are not available. All of those things. Oh
my, we're twinning right now. One last thing before I ask the next question too is like August Bradley, I mentioned his pipes, pillars, and vaults earlier, and one thing he talks about with the databases in Notion is the dependent tasks. So Me and him both looked at other tools out there for like task management, project management, including Asana, and I tried all of them, and I found that having dependent tasks was a very unique feature. Now it's a little bit more common, but this was back in 2017, 2018-ish, and it was frustrating. But Notion can have these dependent tasks that it will not show up for you in your main like view if you want, unless you have that first task done, and that dependent task will move into place for it, and so forth.
Mm.
So it's
Do you use the
fascinating.
formulas for that?
I think it's formulas. I think it's either a roll up or I think it's relational or roll up, something like that. I think it's a roll up one. And
Okay.
but like you can use formulas. For example, in my Polycast guest CRM, I use a formula to say, okay, it's been 4 months since I last talked to Nikki. I should reach out to her. So
Mm.
yeah, I'll let you
Cool. Yeah, I
copy that.
haven't used the formulas. I should totally do
Yeah, steal it.
that.
Okay, so you have a great looking and quality podcast, obviously. And so how has that been developing for you? What's new with it?
Oh, wow. Oh, I do a lot of things. I tweak things here and there all the time.
Yeah.
So I know earlier where we talked about how people shouldn't be afraid to change. I've changed a lot. So even at the beginning, when people asked me about what Chief Best Friends was last year when I launched it, I tell people that it's a podcast about mixing friendship and business together. And it kind of like made sense at that time. It was easier for people to kind of, oh, yeah, I can kind of like understand what that means. But now, after it's kind of like grown up a little bit, so now I tell people that it's about helping women succeed in work and business by cultivating meaningful friendships. So it's kind of like the same, but a little bit more, there's more positioning now.
Yeah. Well, I was just gonna say evolution's a perfect process of this. Like it just happens as you go.
Yeah, exactly. And even the website, I've kind of like changed it 3 times. The cover art has changed as well for season 2. And I'm just constantly kind of like improving the user experience for the website because
Yeah.
I think it's a job hazard because I'm in growth, so I'm always looking at like the funnel, right? But I think after a while, you kind of like when I think of, okay, so I have a podcast, I have a newsletter, and eventually I'd love to create a community. How can I create a website so that it encapsulates all of these things? Because for the most part, the website has only just been about the podcast,
Yeah.
right? So I needed to make room and space to talk about my newsletter, to talk about potential community. And nobody's keeping track, but I've been keeping track of the way that my website has evolved over the few months, even just for
Yeah.
2020, is that I've kind of like rejigged it to really offer it the space that it needs for it to evolve. So before it was very podcast focused, all about my guests and my audience. Now it's kind of like moving into more of like a lifestyle site where Chief Best Friends is not just a podcast. There is a podcast. There's a newsletter, and then eventually I'm going to start talking about the community soon. And then before even the blog used to be hidden somewhere, now I've kind of like put it out top because I'm slowly moving into SEO territory, and I'm
Oh yeah. That's a whole nother beast.
exactly. So yes, I've kind of like just evolved it over time just based on how much energy I can really put into it. So last year when I launched it, I had a full-time job. My project was really kind of like a weekend thing, right? And so even the way that I promoted it last year was so different from how I'm promoting it this year, where it's kind of like my full-time job. So for me, I've kind of just kind of like nipped at the problem over the years, and it's kind of like how it's gone. But yeah, like when you said like what's changing for Chief Best Friends is that one aspect that I really want to start introducing is the community aspect of it. Just because when I've spoken to my guests, a lot of themes are coming up. Like even though we're in business or we're in the workplace, fine, we have the same problems as most people are, regardless of gender. But obviously, being women, there are some biases that we have to kind of like work through, right? And we need a place for those conversations. But at the same time, when I go and research, there's a lot of community out there. Each community serves different purposes, and basically, I don't want to create the community. I don't want to basically take over all of the female founder communities, but it's more of like I want to create something that is missing. What is the gap in the communities that are available for female founders out there, and what can I do to be able to serve that gap? So those are some of the things that have been going on in my head. I've been doing a lot of research, and I think I've kind of figure out what it might be. It might be an accountability group, a mastermind group of that sort. But yeah, still in very early stages. But hopefully
Yeah.
in the next month or so, I could introduce it.
Well, and what's interesting is that, like, again, our paths are kind of similar in a way where seeing the sites evolve over time and kind of putting it on that slow burner and, like you said, nipping away at it in a way.
Yeah.
And mine started out as a blog and then eventually tried to make it into a community. Just like you're saying, they're like, make it a community for Polymath in a way, these
Yeah.
innovators. And the problem was I kept trying to use BuddyPress, which is like the WordPress plugin. Oh, screw BuddyPress, dude.
No.
Like, I can't stand it anymore. But and I tried Mighty Networks and all that stuff. I actually came across one recently, and
Circle.
no, actually, it's not the Tribe. And
Ooh.
so what I was going to mention is that I don't usually mention this in a recording, but I made a tribe for these polymath people, these people who are multidisciplinary or T-shaped. And so I wanted to bring people like that together. And at the moment, I've only been inviting my guests because I'm still experimenting with it. And I'm going to invite you after this as well. And I think that it might be a good experiment for you. Perhaps maybe if you like it, you can use it for your own community as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard about Tribe, but I don't think I've been in a community where they're using Tribe. I think the golden child right now is Circle. So I've been in a couple of communities where Circle is the platform of choice. So I'd love to definitely check out how Tribe is and how if that would be a good kind of like platform for the community that I'm trying to build.
Well, it's a nice social network in a way. You can build groups and you can have messages and stuff like that. And speaking of which, you're on that mission to empower and raise Asian women's voices. So how do you aim to accomplish that beyond the community? How do you want to do it?
Yeah, when I wrote that mission, I thought it was going to be around podcasting. So I wanted more women to come into podcasting, just because when I started it, really, I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and I've seen how the podcast industry changed over the years. Where before, a lot of it were just male voices, all coming from the U.S., UK, or Australia, and then slowly over time, I started seeing shows run by women. I'm like, oh, this is so great. But then I realized, hang on a second, there's not a lot of Asian women doing podcasting. So when I wrote that, I really wanted a lot more women to be on podcasting. Because when people ask me, why did I choose a podcast as kind of like my format for Chief Best Friends? Technically, it sounds like could potentially be an online magazine or even a YouTube channel, all of those things. Yeah. Right. But I tell them, okay, so I'm trying to talk about the biases that, women have in the workplace. And I feel like a lot of the current formats that is available right now are very visual. And obviously women are most of the time objectified, right? And we feel a lot of stress in the way we look and all of those things. I feel like the audio platform is such a perfect channel for us to just start sharing our stories, because we don't need to worry about our hair, our makeup, or anything. If we want to be featured in a magazine, we have to worry about all of these things. Maybe I need to go on a diet before the photo shoot or whatever, those things, right? Or if it's a YouTube thing, then I need to prepare my face and all of that. Because even though we might not be into, let's say, our appearances, a lot of the viewers would care, right, about those things. So I feel like the audio experience is so good for women. The barrier to entry is so low. If you have a mic, you don't need to, you can be in your pajamas, you have your face mask on, doesn't matter. People don't know if you're just talking, right? So to me, the platform itself is so good for women because there's no barrier for entry. And I felt as well, like if I'm wanting to reach a lot of women, we're always running around doing errands for families, children, husbands, all of those things. And I feel like the audio experience is so much easier to plug into our day versus having to sit down and watch a video. So in those two sides, that's one of the reasons why I kind of like I'm trying to champion voice as the platform of choice for a lot of women to tell our stories. But now, when I think about it, it's also not just voice in terms of a format, but really our stories. And I think that's one of the reasons why I keep doing Chief Best Friends, is because the women that I bring on the show, it's their story, it's their voice that I'm really trying to raise, right? And then hopefully with the community, women who are starting their own businesses would be able to help other women. So it's kind of like they're all interconnected in a way. Having a community helps women find a place where their voice is heard and listened to, and then we can do kind of like the great work that we're set out to do, and then help more women in that process.
Yeah. I love that. And it's interesting too, because when you have audio, you get to experience it whenever you want, working out in your pajamas. And I record videos because first off, I've always liked video shows, but I know there's other people like me who like to watch it. They want to see you laugh. They want to see me make a joke. They want to see my hand's moving right now to express this. You couldn't hear that. You can't hear my hand making waves or something like that in the air. And so like, people want to see it, but I do also feel bad. Like I ask for people to always be on the videos, and I know that some people, like for women especially, there's that societal norm, like, hey, I gotta get my makeup on, fix my hair and stuff like that. And I fix my hair before doing it. I'm a little bit more self-conscious about like things. Like I thought about what color shirt should I wear for this? Should I wear
Black is good.
Black is good, but I also have a PolyInnovator red shirt, so I'm like, maybe I should wear that one. And so it's like I actually made myself at the beginning. When I first started doing these interviews, wearing a blazer, but it got so hot.
I'm wearing a little jacket right now too.
Yeah. I got a fan right here that's been blowing on me this entire time, and I'm still sweating. Like this is one of those things where, like, obviously you're not gonna have to worry about that. But I just wanted to say I empathize with people having to prepare, and I loved how you're trying to empower voices.
Actually, I like this video format because it feels more natural, right? Like if you see the person having that conversation feels better in a way.
Well, and I think even as a viewer too. So like, how has, then kind of pivoting more to you, how has your mentorship been progressing thus far then?
Oh, I love it. We just wrapped up the Project Voice Scholarship Program where I mentored 3 women who wanted to birth a podcast into the world. So 2 of them have already launched. So that's really great. I love that experience because it helped crystallize that even though I am not the Joe Rogan of podcasting, I have been doing it for a year or so. And I do have knowledge, not just from podcasting, but my experience doing growth marketing that I could share with my mentees. And so doing mentorship has helped a lot with my self-confidence because now you've kind of like have to teach what you learn, right? And then I'm like, oh yeah, actually I do know quite a number of things.
Okay.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, I realized that I love doing it. I love teaching people. I think that's why I wanted to do more workshops online. It's because I probably know a lot of things that could help a lot of women as well in terms of starting podcasting. So we just wrapped that up. That's really great. It's still ongoing. And then I'm also a mentor for early stage startups. So I'm part of the startup mentors under Iterative Capital. So they are a new accelerator here in Singapore. 3 partners of that accelerator actually started in San Francisco. So they started it here in Singapore because I think one of them is from Hong Kong, 2 were originally from Malaysia, but they all grew up in the US and they wanted to kind of like be in this region. So I'm helping out in terms of mentorship. So a lot of the startups that are in their accelerator, they can come to me and ask me anything to do with growth marketing. So that's kind of like still ongoing. It's not a very formal and official role, but I'm just sort of there if anybody needs me. And I think I would love to do more of this. It's just great to kind of like go through my experiences and be able to package that up into something. Yeah. So hopefully I get to do that either with somebody partnering with them or maybe starting my own. So hopefully my accountability group or kind of like a mastermind group or whatever you call it could kind of like be a little bit of a mentorship as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. So what do you think is next for you then, what you're working on? Maybe what's your next micro focus in a way?
Yeah, my next micro focus is creating a product or creating something like a product or a service in order for me to be able to earn revenue. So when a lot of people ask like, how do you monetize a podcast? There are people who really monetize the podcast, like the episodes, and get sponsors for everything. But because of the nature of my podcast where it's not episodic, it's more seasonal, I don't have a lot of ad spots because I don't create continuously. So to me, the podcast itself is more of like a marketing tool, awareness tool. And then the way that I'm hoping to monetize. So the next few months really for me is kind of like heads down thinking of what to create. October, I've actually put in October as like a challenge for me to be able to produce something. So in the next 4 weeks of October, when October ends, I should have a product ready. Basically, that's it. It's a challenge.
I need to first off connect you with someone named Doc Williams, who's been talking about this idea of a minimal viable build. So like not just like an
Mm,
MVP, but like the build of your product and service there. And
yeah.
I was on his live stream recently. It was really interesting. I think you would really benefit and enjoy it. But on top of that too, it's like I need to steal that idea. That needs to be my next resolution. Like I'm on the same spot where I need to find some way to monetize. And
Yeah.
something we didn't really actually get into is that my main series is an omni-channel series. And I want to build micro SaaS for that. And I think that you might really interested in that too.
Oh,
So
interesting.
that's your next thing. That's my next thing. What do you think could be like the next thing or a call to action for the people in the audience there today then?
Yeah. So for those of you who are listening or watching, if you're interested to know or listen to my podcast, the best place to go really is chiefbestfriends.com. There are links in there to sign up for my newsletter, which is all about business, friendships, and funds within the region here in Asia Pacific. And then we can also connect online. I'm Chief Best Friends on Instagram. If you're on Twitter, it's Niki Paniki. That's my personal one. But if you just go on chiefbestfriends.com, all of the links to the socials are there anyway. So that's really kind of like the best place
Yeah.
to go and look. And I know you saw my workshops in my personal site, which is nikitorres.com, but I'm hoping to move them onto Chief Best Friends. So basically, I'm really making Chief Best Friends kind of like my home on the internet.
Yeah. Well, PolyInnovator for me is my personal brand, despite the fact it looks more like a professional brand too. Like, and I think that's kind of what's happening for you, where you're mixing those together as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, and that's perfect. I'll have all the links in the description for you as well. What could be something then, like a call to action for people like to do besides us checking out your awesome podcast and looking at your workshops and whatnot? What can people do to improve themselves, start the new cycle in a way?
Oh yeah. I guess it's for a lot of folks, it requires a lot of self-awareness. So if you think you're a multipotentialite or potentially could be a polymath, then I would really suggest just going with your gut feeling. Go where your curiosity really takes you. Go where you want to spend like a whole day just doing that one thing, and just kind of like diving deep. Don't be afraid to just explore, because I think I've gone through a lot of that exploration earlier in my career, and it's only recently where it's slowly coming together. So I think no rush, just go explore first, and then in your own time, as more things come into yourself, more things kind of like happen to you, more experiences happen to you, you'll be able to crystallize a lot of those things, and then suddenly it will just all click together. I feel like everything is 2020 on hindsight, right? So
Yeah.
sometimes you just have to go through the journey. When you're in the thick of that journey, you can't really see like, why am I doing this? But sometimes when you walk a little bit further, you just have to keep going. When you look back, you kind of like see where you've been, and then you'll be like, oh, that's
Yeah.
why.
I love that. And that's why I like asking that question in that way. Because like obviously I want the call to action to be like, hey, go check out this awesome person's stuff. There's a reason why I had her on the show. But then like that second call to action, that kind of idea of what you can do. What you just said there was just so great and amazing for people to go try out. I love that. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Well, thank you for coming on the Polymath podcast. You're Niki and I'm Dustin. And yeah, cheers.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.